Thanks very much, and good morning, everyone. And it certainly feels like a summer school, given the weather. I think we're all going to melt this morning in the room, which is great. The question that we're discussing here today assumes that we have one political culture, and in fact, I believe we have many, and I want to touch on that in my contribution. And I want to begin by saying that we have a reputation of being the fighting Irish, and I know that that is linked to the American Civil War, but I think it goes beyond that. Our boxers, men and women, the Irish rugby team, All-Ireland final day, I think we can all see that passion can bring us to a whole other level. We're an emotional or spiritual people rather than a material culture, often expressed through song, dance, literature. And for example, I don't believe the built heritage is a huge feature of our culture, which is different to our nearest neighbour. So much so that when we achieved material wealth, I'm not sure that we knew what to do with it. There's no doubt that the impact of the crash has had really devastating impacts on many. And I doubt that many of us in this room would disagree with Laurel and Hardy when they said that money doesn't buy you happiness, but it does upgrade despair beautifully. That, of course, depends on whose hand it's in and how much of it there is. There appears to be, I think, a courageous gene when it comes to our general culture, but when it comes to politics, we seem to be a fairly passive lot, and we seem to articulate the need for radical reform, and then we want to deliver it through conservative entities. There's a lack of choice, not just in ideologies, but also in how politics is practiced. And to use a cliché, you can't separate the political from the organisational. In recent weeks, we heard the term used, rule with both the heart and the head. And there's no doubt that good decision-making can happen at both levels. However, when it comes to politics, I do think we need both to have balanced outcomes. We've had an awful lot of emotional politics rather than the balance between emotional and intellectual, which I think gives much more balanced outcomes for the short, medium and long term. Emotional politics can, however, be a window through, to get some citizen engagement, and it often leads to longer-term actions. You might, for example, not like how much tribunals of inquiries cost or how long they take to come to conclusions, but they were formed following heightened citizen engagement through really the emotion of anger. Their findings will, however, have longer-term lasting impacts on things like planning and ethics in politics. Emotions, I think, change much more quickly than ideas, but people gain a better understanding of institutional failures through practical examples. Recent examples are the withdrawal of discretionary medical cards, or indeed the housing and homelessness crisis, where you see individuals or citizens exposed, and you can see the hard cases in relation to medical need, or you can see situations where people are forced to, with maybe families, sleep in a car or hostels or short-term accommodation. And that gains some public understanding, and it triggers an emotional, sometimes rage, sometimes anger. But the problem is, most of these things could be avoided because we can anticipate these kind of things happening, but we don't do that because we tend to have a more reactive rather than proactive system. The more dynamic political side of our policy making is not functioning, and it needs to function, and we need to have institutions that are much more citizen-friendly. About 2% of our population are involved in political parties, and that's low by international standards. And any of us that have canvassed would know, you'd be with some degree of certainty, that's a Fianna Fáil house or that's a Fine Gael house. And the membership of both of those parties will account for most of that 2% of those who are active in politics. Some of that political activity, however, is passive between elections. In the case of Fianna Fáil, a lot of its membership are involved in community activism in organisations like the GAA, which is understandable given both origins, in residents' groups, in chambers of commerce, etc. However, the members can be called upon when it comes to, elections, the Ardèche and so on. And if we're to examine the intertwining of our political and administrative institutions, I think we have to look at the internal culture of the political parties. The political party that has been the most dominant over the years has been Fianna Fáil, who have been in power for over 60 years in total. The Fianna Fáil family is more about followers than a party of equal members. Loyalty plays a big part in its culture, and loyalty is rewarded as often as possible. There are more rewards available when the party is in power, and this approach has led in recent years, or has led up to recent years, to what we would know as a crony culture, and of course that applied to all parties when they were in power. Fianna Fáil saw itself as of the people, and that's not surprising given how its members merge into the community between elections. It's a pragmatic party and it hovers around the political centre, and it generally follows change rather than leads it. It's seen as slightly anti-establishment, which is a real achievement given the length of time that it's been in power, and part of the reason for this is that it outsources a lot of its functions. For example, education and health were outsourced to religious institutions or orders, who were then trusted, and I use the word trusted, to deliver services. But accountability was also outsourced. The HSE was designed to be at one remove, which follows the same kind of trend. Another, obviously, part of the anti-establishment origins will have been the anti-treaty aspect of that party. And Fianna Fáil's membership is drawn from a wide spectrum within society. They've been prone to seeing the civil service as an extension of themselves. They ceded the policy making to the civil service, and many in the senior ranks up to relatively recently were appointed by them, so much so that it muddied the lines between the political and administrative. While Fine Gael draws its membership from a narrower base, it's quite paternal in its practice of politics. It's often found itself in power in difficult times and out of power after one term. There are many similarities between both parties, but loyalty is one of the essential ingredients, and loyalty is the route to reward, whether that reward takes the form of nomination to a state board, promotion through the ranks, or access to a minister. Loyalty in politics is often a conservative value. It's used as a means of self-preservation. Citizens are now seeing loyalty in that context as misplaced. Then instead of building functioning institutions that have been designed with the citizen at the centre, where taxation is seen as a function of social solidarity, we instead operate a clientelist system for those who cannot navigate access to public services they're paid for and should be entitled to. TDs act as middlemen or middlewomen, instead of fixing the system, we're on a never-ending merry-go-round of fixing problems. It individualises issues between the politician and the citizen. The clientelist system maintains politics at an emotional level, where there is an expectation of a vote in return for a favour. It dilutes the possibility of social solidarity, and it makes citizens dependent rather than independent, and it's part of the reasons why we're so passive. It also is probably pretty good for Joe Duffy's leadership, but is absolutely no way to design and to deliver services to citizens in a republic. A simplified and more transparent approach may produce better public engagement, which should include creating a relationship between what we pay for and what we get. The universal social charge, who knows what it's for other than the state is short of money? Or the property tax, and the current debate around the property tax is almost exclusively around it being reduced, rather than what services it's paying for and how those services were funded prior to its introduction. It is not generated or collected locally, which is where the democratic process should see a friction between the political choices offered and where political engagement should properly take place. In terms of our institutions, we're not good at institutional building. Health, education, legal and local government systems were all inherited. They were tweaked rather than reformed or redesigned as needed. To add to that, we have a tendency to outsource service delivery. Not only was the function or service outsourced, accountability was also outsourced, as I said earlier. The lack of clarity for citizens in accessing services is more complicated and, as a consequence, fragmented and compromised, often leading to poorer outcomes, and hence we're back on the clientelist merry-go-round. I think the late Peter Muir put it very well when he said, and I quote, "A political world which has ceded much of its control to other organisations and groups, and which has become autonomous and self-contained, rarely connected in any meaningful sense to life outside itself," unquote. We're governed by a type of paternal conservatism, which is the opposite of what should occur in a republic. The lack of transparency has been used in a very deliberate way to avoid confrontation, and it comes back to bite, and it can cost more in the end. People are presented with a fait accompli. It often makes them feel very aggrieved and very powerless, and I think that is obviously a major issue. Fear and insecurity is also used to manage expectation. An example was the response to economist Morgan Kelly when he warned about the bubble that was inflating in the property market. The political response was to dismiss him and others and advise them that they needed to stop talking down the economy. Our political leaders and their chosen experts knew better and kept reassuring people that we're in for a soft landing. Political leadership, after all, was about telling people what they wanted to hear. When the crash happened, there was bound to be a reaction. While huge numbers of citizens did not take to the streets, they did exact political revenge through the ballot box. There's no doubt that anger partly drives that response, which is understandable. It would, however, be a mistake to view this response as a short-term emotional reaction solely rooted in revenge. I believe it is stored up determination, it's very deliberate, and it's also intended to be creative. Anyone who canvassed during the most recent local and European elections will have an inkling of why 28% of people voted independent. Political parties are seen by some as clubs with two agendas, the internal one being hidden but dominant. Those voting independent continuously expressed the view that they want black to be black and white to be white. They've had it with spin. They've had it with the control of the backbenchers through sanctions imposed by the whip system. They see intelligent people who are capable of independent thought and action effectively being muzzled. They wanted those elected to be servants of the people and not servants of the party. Political parties need to respond in a meaningful way to that message. It's true to say that citizens have become more confident and competent in analysing complex matters. They've seen so many so-called experts get it so badly wrong that it has resulted in increasing numbers of people trusting their own judgment. There's a new freedom in how people are prepared to vote. They will make judgments in what they believe is in their own best interest, and I believe it's essential that that's turned into a collective interest rather than individual interest. And what amazed me during the recent local elections was the degree to which experts' commentators were ignored. And there was almost a snobbery in how the independent vote was analysed by some commentators following the elections. It was seen as a problem rather than an opportunity for a more equal relationship between citizens and those who represent them. It was possible for some commentators to be rational about those who had chosen to vote for Sinn Féin, because basically it came in the form of a political party, yet it still offered a radical agenda and a vehicle for revenge and creativity. The same people who analysed the supposed problems posed by independents failed to consider the organisational obstacles posed by Sinn Féin, who were organised on an all-Ireland basis. How would that work if the party was in power in both jurisdictions? It probably would work very well, but it's a question. Would a campaigning party be compatible with government? And how would a party where members have an equal role in decision-making, which I quite like actually, how would that work if it found itself in government? The point I'm trying to make is that Sinn Féin, like any other party, bring their own challenges, but they come in a neat package called a political party. There is an acceptance at citizen level that there's a need for radical reform, and that will not come from a conservative political establishment. So we have to ask ourselves, has the political centre shifted? And will it produce greater political diversity? And just as importantly, will it change how politics is practised? The dominant culture in the Dáil, for example, is of one of control. The government has the power, and basically the opposition, backbenchers, the Seanad, all have influence to a greater or lesser degree. The Constitution provides for a separation of powers, but everything from the selection of committee membership to the timetable of the Dáil is controlled by government. It is, however, difficult to see how new entities will successfully emerge, partly because how politics is funded. The relationship between political parties and the corporate sector, with the construction sector dominant, has been costly on so many levels. A more restrictive donation regime has recently been introduced. In recent years, significant transfers towards the cost of running politics and political parties comes from the Exchequer. However, the way funding is provided favours the status quo. Electoral Act funding is allocated on the basis of the first preference vote in the preceding election. And indeed, while funding like the Parliamentary Activities Allowance, formerly known as the Leaders' Allowance, is paid in respect of every member of the Dáil, with the exception of the Ceann Comhairle, it is paid to the party leader in most cases, but individually to independents, as defined as independent the day they were elected, not somebody that became independent since. So when a party member loses the whip, the party leader retains the allowance, which limits the parliamentary activity of the member losing the whip. If a parliamentary activities allowance was paid directly to the member, who could choose then to give it to the party if they so wished, it would replace or would rebalance the power in favour of the individual member. This would result in a greater respect for the mandate and help to change the culture. It's interesting to note that political parties are nowhere in the Constitution are they mentioned. It's the individual mandate that is recognised. The right to form associations is accepted to mean political party. So just to finish up, the definition of good leadership is about making the right decisions. The definition of good management is about carrying out those tasks. And really we need to see them as separate spheres, and they need to be treated as such. While it's possible to have popular leaders, particularly at times of plenty, we need to redefine what leadership is. I once heard it described as all about delivering loss. Well, if leadership is about delivering loss, it can only be done by grounding it in values like equality, solidarity and fairness. Otherwise, those who are subject to unpopular decisions will not find acceptance in the decisions that are made. We also need to redefine the word accountability. In some cases, as I've said earlier, trust was taken to mean responsibility and accountability when functions were outsourced. We've also developed a culture where accountability equates to blame, which is seen as a negative. We need to spell out what we mean, and we need to change the culture to match that. Transparency and accountability are also seen as problem creators rather than essential in a functioning society. Consultation takes time, energy and it costs up front, but over time it delivers returns both tangible and intangible. The provision of information in a digestible format in a timely way is essential. Citizen engagement should be made easy by simplifying the process to provide for that. There are some good initiatives underway and I want to see more of them. The Open Data and Open Partnership Group is a good example and I warmly welcome that. I think it's fair to conclude that many of our institutional failings are rooted in our political culture or cultures. There's a huge reform agenda. If we were to change that culture or cultures, it will take political will, it will take political diversity, and it will take some visionary leadership. Thank you.